Hello, happy Friday, students. Welcome to the episode 3 of the Matthew Schoen Sociology experience. And this episode is the first one that is being filmed in Dr. Schoen's Panic Room. You will be seeing quite a bit more of the Panic Room over the remaining month. Today is going to be a shorter video, kind of corresponding to the fact that our Friday classes tended to be a little bit shorter than average. So I have two things I want to accomplish today with this. I want to give you a kind of visual look at what you need to be looking at to complete assignment 2, which is due on Friday, March 27th. Okay. And so because we have been looking at these major sociological statuses, specifically race, gender, and social class, I ask you to take the material that we've covered and to take the information that we've gone through and apply much of this information to a place that I hope you know very well, and that is your hometown. Okay. So if you have had a chance to look at the instructions, you know that you do have you have a data task that you have to complete, and that will take you to the American Fact Finder. It's a good thing we're getting this in early because, as you can see here, it looks like it will be taken offline on March 31st, 2020. So don't do this late. Otherwise, it's going to have to go to a system that none of us understand at the moment. Now, once you click the link that is provided in the instruction sheet, this is where you should end up. In order to get the information that you need, you will need to scroll down to the bottom here, and you will see address search. Find census data by entering a street address. So I click on this, and this will show up. Very simple. All you need to do here is enter your street address. And if you moved around a lot growing up, pick the address or pick the area that you feel best corresponds to your childhood experience, right? The place you lived the longest is what I would do, but I sort of leave that up to you. Whichever one you choose, type in an address. And then hit go. Now watch this very carefully. This is described in the instruction sheet, but some people are visual learners, so be very careful that you are selecting the right thing. This is a process that is by no means difficult, but if you click the wrong thing, you will get the wrong answers, and that is going to affect your performance on this assignment. So here's what I need to do. I need to click on the census tract. So this is geography type census tract, geography code 140. By clicking on that, it will isolate my data search to only this particular census tract. And a tract is the Census Bureau's best approximation of a neighborhood. The population should be between 3,000 people and 5,500 people, although in rural areas it may be less. In very dense urban areas like New York City, it may ultimately be more. So I will click on that, and now I need to click on Topics over here on the left. I then click on Data Set, and I select the 2017 ACS 5-year estimates. Very important to grab the most recent data that is available to us. People always say, wait, hold on, it's 2020 and all I have is 2017. Well, are you able to do this for a country of 327.7 million people? It takes a little bit of time to process the data. Now, everything you need will be found in one table, and that is S0601, selected characteristics of the total and native populations in the United States. So by clicking on that, I then now need to build a table, and feel free to use the example that I gave you in that assignment as a template. You just have to obviously remove my information and put in your own information. And you will see that, okay, in this particular neighborhood of Ann Arbor that I have selected, 2,791 people live. The median age, that's the midpoint, is 36.2. I can see that this neighborhood is about 51% male, 49% female. I can see by looking at race, and then you'll see that Hispanic or Latino origin as a separate category. That's because, as I said earlier in the week, Hispanic Latino is an ethnicity, not a race. So I can see that 80% of the population is white. I can see that about 10% of the population in this neighborhood is Black, 5.5% is Asian, and only 3.5% are Hispanic. So just by looking at, I can see this is a pretty white community, which does match up with my experiences of this neighborhood. Then I will be looking at certain things like education. You're going to want the percentage. Only 5.5% are a terminal high school graduate. That's I graduated high school and nothing more. 14.2% finished an associate's degree, 30% have a bachelor's degree, and 47% have a graduate or professional degree. Kind of meshes with what we already think we know about Ann Arbor. So you're going to want to add bachelor's degree and graduate professional degree together. And I'm going to also want to look at the median income. I can see that this is probably a lot higher than the state average. And I'm also going to want to look at the poverty status. Some of you have asked me about this already. You want to be looking for below 100% of the poverty level. 100% of the poverty level is the poverty level. So below 100%, that's great. That's the group of people that are living below that poverty line we discussed in the social class area. Build this table out. And then you will want to repeat these steps, except instead of selecting the census tract as my unit of analysis, I will want to select the state. Numbers are great, but that's all they are. They need a comparison in order to make any sense. So once I add state to my selections in this top left-hand corner of the screen, I will now hit the X next to census tract. And now any table that I look at, and I want to be looking at the same one, S0601, now I see that instead of the 2,700 people thereabouts or whatever it was that lived in my neighborhood, now in the state of Michigan, 9,925,568. And the numbers look a little bit different. It appears that the median age is higher than my neighborhood's average. It appears that Michigan is a little less white and a little more black than my neighborhood. These are the things you want to be looking at. Do you see significant differences between the state level and the neighborhood level? And then write me a paper that talks about race, gender, class within this neighborhood that you grew up in. Use your sociological imagination. Use the positioning that you have, the experience to connect this data to your own experiences. And that's really what I'm looking for the most. Okay, so that is due a week from today, right? As of the time of this being consumed by you. Do a good job, really do a good job. Connect things to the concepts that we have, connect things to these statuses, and try to understand about male, female, white, black, Hispanic, poor, not poor, educate. Like, think about what these variables mean for the community. Think about reasons why you see certain demographic realities within the community. Okay, and I am happy to answer questions as they arise. Okay. So a quick slideshow presentation that I want to work through here related to this concept of residential segregation. Okay, so the big question is, who cares ultimately? Who cares? The podcast goes in depth about people living in certain areas, but the key thing here is understanding that it's all about access to resources. It is all about what resources you are conceivably able to access based on where you are living. And so we do live in a country where people get some say over where they choose to live. And that's a good thing. I certainly wouldn't want to trade that. But our residential choice is very much influenced by many institutional practices from the past, right? One might call that past and present discrimination, and side effect discrimination that we went over on Wednesday, in that inequality in certain areas affects where we're able to live, the type of wealth we're able to generate, and how we are able to essentially buy resources and services, okay? So place determines access to resources, the jobs that you get, the services that you can expect, expect, the type of education that you can expect to be getting, health and safety at the neighborhood level, and collective efficacy, which is this measure of kind of how much does a neighborhood feel like a community? How willing are people to work together to accomplish difficult things? How willing are people to intervene on behalf of neighbors and behalf of the whole neighborhood if things are going in a bad direction? Okay, so as you saw in the article that I assigned, the segregation index of dissimilarity, which is this metric from 0 to 100, 0 equals perfect no segregation. It's pretty hypothetical because there is no such area where that is. And 100 is fully segregated, also hypothetical because there is no neighborhood there is no area that is 100% segregated. So higher numbers here do correspond to a more segregated city. Now, if we look at metropolitan areas and measure this from 1980, 90, 2000, and 2010, and I will be very interested to see the 2020 census data, assuming that still goes forward and goes ahead, we can see a few things. The first thing I take away from this is that most metropolitan areas are deeply segregated places. They just are, right? They just are. But that is something that is getting better over time. Los Angeles, Dallas, Chicago, and Miami, along with Atlanta and New York City, all experienced pretty large declines in segregation over the last 40 years. We are sharing space a little bit more. But when I look at these numbers, I'm almost wondering if I'm missing the forest through the trees. Yeah, this stuff is going down. Yes, segregation is decreasing. Yes, people of color are more able to access white neighborhoods in a way that their ancestors never, ever could. But these numbers are high. And segregation at the neighborhood level in the United States tends to be higher than many other industrialized democracies. But, we do have a much higher level of racial and ethnic diversity than many other countries. So I often wonder, is it really fair to single out our country when others just don't have the level of diversity to even make this a potential issue? And I will say the only other country in Europe that has kind of this taken for granted level of diversity that we have is probably France. And France also has pretty spectacular levels of racial and ethnic segregation, throughout French cities. So maybe this is just an inherent part of metropolitan areas. Okay, so the article references this thing known as the Detroit Area Survey. This was interesting. It looks and shows that people were given a hypothetical ideal neighborhood, and they had to rate their willingness to live in the area based on who is there with you, who are your neighbors. And this does show that over time, your tolerance for integration is increasing. People are more willing to stay in integrated neighborhoods. People are less willing or less vocal about moving out of neighborhoods that perhaps are developing a type of racial and ethnic diversity that was not acceptable before. However, while I accept these findings and I do respect the Detroit Area Survey and what the DAS has done over many, many years of putting together kind of cohort data and longitudinal data, at the same time, there is a flaw with this study, and perhaps flaw is not the right term to be using, perhaps just something like a caveat, something to keep in mind. And it's that people are asked here about hypothetical neighborhoods. People do not move into hypothetical neighborhoods. People move into real neighborhoods with real schools and real neighbors and real streets and real parks and real crime rates. And as a result, it's never quite known for sure how this type of preference translates into where people are actually living. Okay. And where people are actually living is very much determined by the type of, by the institutional practices of the past. So I mentioned past and present discrimination. Here's a really good example of this. We don't have laws anymore, that allow you to make a white-only neighborhood or a neighborhood that can have absolutely no Jewish households in it, for example, as happened in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and up to the civil rights era throughout the South. But our cities still bear the scars of a process known as redlining. So redlining occurred in the aftermath of World War II, when the federal government was starting to pump a lot of money into urban areas and try to really enter into housing markets and saw housing markets as a real core element for building a middle class. And it's not hard to see why. I did say that on Wednesday, that like this is the way that most people build wealth. This is the way that most people are going to try and solidify their retirement. Now, areas that were deemed to be hazardous, and I put that in quotation because that was the actual term that was used by the federal government. And you're talking about especially the 50s and 60s here. Areas deemed hazardous were declared ineligible for federal loans. Hazardous can mean a lot of things, but I think you see where this is going. We're not talking about hazardous in terms of there's nuclear waste and pollution there. We're not talking about hazardous as in there's a bunch of grizzly bears roaming the neighborhood. We are talking about hazardous as integration, right? So if a high percentage of, if there were a high percentage of Black households and neighborhoods within, or Black households and families within that neighborhood, that was declared to be a hazardous neighborhood. And what real estate agents had to do then was draw with a red pencil, essentially a marker around that neighborhood and redline it. That's what the term literally means. They drew red lines around the integrated neighborhood. Now, in the case of Philadelphia, take a look at what was redlined in Philadelphia. It looks like parts of South Philly and Southwest Philly and parts of North Philly. Not coincidentally, if we look at the racial map here today, you can see that on the north side of Philly and the southwest side of Philly, this is where the Black population is still living. And Philly's a good example to look at this because it's one of the few urban areas that is known for having concentrated white poverty. Generally speaking, white poverty tends to be rural, Black poverty tends to be urban, but there's 4 cities that are known for having a very, a well above average percentage of concentrated white poverty. And those cities are Boston, Philadelphia, Columbus, Ohio, and Indianapolis, Indiana. So if we look at where the Black population is living today, we do see that it corresponds quite nicely to areas that were redlined. And that's not just where people are living, that's generations of wealth that was not generated over this time frame that was generated within white areas. And the consequences of that are massive. It has taken wealth out of Black communities in a way that has really never been fixed and never been addressed, even in the era of civil rights. Good example that might be a little bit closer to home for many people if you're from the Detroit metropolitan area. There are 2 neighborhoods that in the massive Detroit expansion of the car and the assembly line, Henry Ford was the first industrialist to do full-on open hiring. So he hired Blacks at the same rate and started both poor whites and poor Blacks at $5 a day, which was a massive wage at the time in the 1910s, early 1920s. But he didn't want integration for a variety of reasons. But one was that he really feared labor power. He didn't want to have to recognize unions. He didn't want white and Black workers to start hanging out with each other, start playing cards with each other, start talking about unionization and strikes and stuff like that. And so ultimately, he built 2 suburbs which his workers would live in, one for white workers and one for Black workers. And you got to understand that these are starting at the same spot, $5 a day, poor whites and poor Blacks. But then over time, the white areas didn't get redlined. The Black lines did get Black areas did get redlined, and it's created a mass departure, a divergence of the fates of these neighborhoods. That white neighborhood is today known as Dearborn Heights. The Black neighborhood is today known as Inkster. And if you're familiar with either of those 2 areas, that should be very clear, like the effect of redlining on a local community. Okay. And we also had things like restrictive covenants, which again, think about this as past and present discrimination, where contractual language that prohibits an owner from doing something very specific with their property can be inserted into any type of sales contract. So I might buy a house in a part of Chicago, but in order to buy that house, I need to agree to a restrictive covenant that I will never sell that house to people of a certain racial, ethnic, or religious background. So the way that you should think about this is that redlining has served to really degrade what used to be minority areas, keep them as segregated areas, whereas restrictive covenants have preserved what were generally white areas. Now, all of this is illegal, but it does ripple out, right? All these years of like an area being white or Black or whatever whatever, you don't think that ripples out? You don't think that creates a really serious issue for people that are trying to live in or trying to advance themselves ultimately within society? So restrictive covenants, I mean, they do have a place. They can be a good thing. And in fact, when the owners of the Utah Jazz professional basketball team sold the team a few years ago, they actually put a restrictive covenant in the contract with the new owners, which deemed that whoever owns this basketball team cannot ever move them out of Salt Lake City. So this was an example of restrictive covenant. It kept a civic institution locally bounded. To me, that's probably a good thing. But when you're talking about keeping neighborhoods away from keeping neighborhoods out of the access of Black families, Jewish families, whatever, that has really long-term consequences about wealth generation, about public institutions that you can ultimately access. And it's not hard to see why and how that creates a really serious problem for minority households trying to advance themselves during this time frame. And then right when the suburbs got really popular, when suburbanization became sort of the modal way of life for a lot of Americans, the majority of people who had an option, who had the ability to leave an area, did. And that is a process. Like if you're from Detroit, you've likely heard of white flight. This was a mass decline in the percentage of the white population within cities. No city lost a higher percentage of its white population than Detroit. So if you're talking about explaining segregation, the fact that people of one ethnic group all moved out to the suburbs, it's not your imagination. It does create an environment where we see generally white suburbs and Black central cities, okay? So segregated neighborhoods always existed, but what this does, this type of flight produces segregation at the city level and at the level of the entire urban area. And so if you're wondering, how did Milwaukee get so segregated? How did Detroit and Chicago get so segregated? Well, neighborhoods first, and then in some cases, the entire city, okay? And then to connect this to, let's say, side effect discrimination, right? One of the major concepts from the last time that we spoke, research shows that even as segregation is getting better over time, right? Dismantling restrictive covenants, dismantling redlining, dismantling white flight being kind of shut off, that's something that does have an effect at the metro level. But contemporary practices, this is probably a better example of a side effect discrimination. And so we do see that during a home search, research indicates that what you heard happening in that podcast does still happen at the residential level and at the level of just one person trying to rent one apartment. So prospective Black buyers and renters generally are shown fewer areas or told about fewer potential units by real estate agents. And part of this might not even be devious. Part of this might just be at the level of implicit bias, where if a Black family looking to buy a home comes to a real estate, oh, I got an area that I think you would like. Oh, yeah, I got another unit I could show you over here. But what this does is create a situation where certain areas are not known about and much harder to access. So if you're renting, Blacks are told about 11.5% fewer units and shown 4.5% fewer units. That cuts down their choice. If you're talking about renting, again, Hispanics are showing 12.5% fewer units and showing 7.5 fewer units. That is something that is absolutely going to reduce neighborhood choice and to reduce the neighborhood type of integration that we currently have. And I also feel, if I just think about like where one of the bigger kind of cultural effects of segregation, it means we understand each other less. It means that we understand the diversity of our country far, far less than we otherwise should and probably need to. Understanding is necessary in order to do difficult things, like what the country is trying to do right now. We need to understand what people are prone to. We need to understand what people need in order to flourish and how group level identities ultimately play into that. And so I'm personally of the opinion that, like, say back in the 60s, you had a pretty oppressive society for really anybody of color in a lot of ways. But economic inequality wasn't as serious as it was today. And so if I think about the long-term effects of this, I just think, is it possible for somebody living in a very segregated Black area of Tallahassee, Florida, and somebody living in an upper middle class white area of Salt Lake City, can those people understand each other at all? I would strongly suspect that it's a very limited type of understanding. Part of that is where you're living. Part of that is the racial background, but you sprinkle economic inequality on top of that. And I think it's a very, very serious problem. I think that you add all these things in together. Where is the capacity to understand people who are living fundamentally different lives than us? So when we have a large country, like often asked, why does the country seem divided on almost every single major issue? Well, again, I think as a result, based on our segregated environments and living around people that are exactly like us generally, and not like, it's not just that the rich make more money than the poor. It's that the rich kind of observe an entirely different set of social mores than the poor do. And you add it all up together, I personally think that goes a long way towards explaining the way in which people are interpreting the social situations that we find ourselves in. One example about this, I'm not going to be the type of person that goes on the record and says, oh, I saw Trump getting elected happening, because that would be a lie. I didn't. I personally was not expecting him to win that election. I guess I would say I was not terribly surprised that he won the nomination, but I was surprised that he won the election. And, people are analyzing this like crazy. What is it that explains it? And people say, oh, well, it's class, it's economic anxiety, or it's racism. My answer to all this stuff is always yes. I think that historians 100 years from now are going to look back on this. And I think that they're going to say, well, look, this guy was in a position where he needed about a dozen different things to go exactly right for him. And they all went exactly right for him. But an example, there's one moment where I started to think that maybe he would win the election. I still wouldn't have bet on it. But the one moment was when Trump broke out of his kind of comfort zone during the 2016 election season. And instead of, and he gave a speech in a major city, which he did not normally do. He gave a speech in Milwaukee, which you will remember is the most segregated city in the entire country. And he gave this absolute firebrand speech to a primarily Black audience in Milwaukee, saying things like, your neighborhoods are awful. You are living in absolute shitholes. You're rotting in poverty. What else do you have to lose? Vote for me. And a lot of people very rightly pointed out that, yeah, poverty is overrepresented in Black neighborhoods and among Black households. It's about 25%. But do the math on that, and that means that 75% of Black households are not living in poverty, and it turns out they would actually have quite a bit to lose, and they actually have a lot that they need to protect and will care about protecting. What a lot of people missed about that, and one of the things that I realized at the time was, what Trump did was he walked into a Black audience and he gave the exact same speech that he was giving to white audiences. The difference is that the white audience believed it, right? This white working class audience believed what he had to say about this, about the degradation of society and various other talking points that he had. It's something that based on where we're living and our environment, like, we lose the ability to understand others. We lose the ability to understand that our experience is just one of many in a very large, diverse environment. And in the absence of that understanding, I am personally very concerned about where that goes, right? And where that goes, because we need to understand each other. We need to be able to talk to each other, to have difficult discussions in order to do difficult things, like what the country is having to do right now at this moment. Okay. So I look forward to reading the assignments that were handed in by Group A, and I very much look forward to reading the assignments that are going to be handed in by everybody next Friday. Thank you very much for watching this, and I'll be in touch next week. Have a great weekend. Please be safe. Take care of yourselves.